Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, I wanted to recap how many Justice Democrats are going to be going into the U.S. House of Representatives coming up. And then also, I'd like to do kind of my own autopsy on how the Justice Democrats did this go around and my recommendation for what types of races they should be putting resources in going into the future and what we learned from this campaign cycle. So starting off, out of the 24 congressional candidates they had, 7 of them were expected to go on and win in convincing fashion. And those are the 7 Justice Democrats that are going to be representing this group in Congress. Beyond that, there was a debate. Maybe there was about 2 to 4 candidates that could possibly make things competitive in Republican-leaning districts, get things really close, maybe even pull off the upset. Unfortunately, none of those Justice Democrats were able to come through. Some of them were extremely close races, but again, not able to get across the finish line. And then about half of the races were in very Republican-leaning districts where they weren't expected to be all that competitive. And for those races, it's really more about planting the seed of progressive ideas in areas of the country that aren't even necessarily exposed to a Democratic message all that often, because the DCCC, for instance, they're not going to put a lot of resources in these long shot type districts. And the Justice Democrats, they can go in and win these primaries rather uncontested in a number of cases, and then have candidates to try to plant those seeds of progressive ideas again in areas of the country that maybe aren't getting access to that type of message otherwise. So I think that that is a pretty low risk situation where it's more of a long-term investment and maybe dividends can pay back in the future in these red districts with those progressive ideas. But beyond that, I want to jump in to the 7 races where the Justice Democrats were able to win. So I'll start down with the incumbents. We had in Arizona's 3rd Congressional District, Raul Grijalva, going on and picking up almost about 64% of the vote, 114,000 plus votes in Arizona's 3rd Congressional District. And then moving over to California's 17th Congressional District with Ro Khanna, almost 160,000 votes, over 75% of the vote there, winning, going away in blowout fashion. Not a surprise as well. And then also moving over to Washington's 7th Congressional District with Pramila Jayapal, almost 330,000 votes, pretty insane number of votes there, over 83% of the vote. And again, not a big surprise to see those 3 incumbents go on and do quite well in their re-election bid. So now, who are the 4 freshmen that are coming in? Well, they're all in very Democratic districts where it wasn't expected to be competitive. So we'll start with Minnesota's 5th Congressional District with Ilhan Omar. It's 267,000 votes, over 78% of the vote. This is Keith Ellison's old seat. The area in and around Minneapolis, again, a very Democratic-leaning district. Moving over to the state of Michigan. Michigan's 13th Congressional District, around the Detroit area with Rashida Tlaib, over 165,000 votes. A Republican didn't even run in this district, not a big surprise there. Over 84% of the vote for the Democratic candidate. And then moving out to the east, we have in Massachusetts, it's the area around Boston, the 7th Congressional District, Ayanna Pressley, an uncontested matchup there, and again, an extremely Democratic district, taking that one. And then also, of course, probably the most well-known Justice Democrat, if I can find it here, in the state of New York, the 14th Congressional District, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, over 100,000 votes, 78% of the vote. And interestingly enough, the person that she beat in her primary, Joe Crowley, got the Working Families Party nomination, and he got over 8,000 votes, and not quite as competitive there as he was with Ocasio-Cortez in the Democratic primary process. But again, not a big surprise to see the Democratic candidate in New York's 14th Congressional District go on and win by a convincing margin. So now I also want to touch on the 2 other closest races where Justice Democrats were almost able to pull it out, but came up just short, and that was Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, where Kara Eastman went on to lose by 2 percentage points against the incumbent Don Bacon. And then also, what's a much more Republican-leaning district than Nebraska's 2nd is out in California's 50th. Duncan Hunter, an embattled incumbent Republican, still able to get over the line, but young up-and-comer Omar doing pretty respectable for himself, again, in a very Republican-leaning district there in the 50th, coming up short by just about 3 or so percentage points. So those were the other 2 races that I just wanted to touch on real quick that were extremely close. And then pretty much every other race, the Justice Democrats lost by double digits, and they weren't all that competitive. So now to wrap up this video, again, I wanted to list out the 4 different kinds of races from most important to least important, where I think that Justice Democrats should focus a lot of their efforts to have success going forward. So first and foremost, getting incumbents that align with their strategy. I think that's a great way to have success going forward because it brings a lot of credibility to the group, and then you don't necessarily need the same type of volunteer power and resources for those candidates to go on and win re-election. So we saw that with Raul Grijalva in Arizona's 3rd, Ro Khanna in California's 17th, as well as Jayapal up there in Washington's 7th congressional district. So again, they bring credibility to the group, and also they can bring resources into the progressive groups going forward, which I think is really important. So then the next on the list is running candidates in primaries in highly liberal-leaning districts. So we had that in Minnesota's 5th congressional district, Michigan's 13th, Massachusetts' 7th, and New York's 14th congressional district. Again, these are situations where if you win your primary, then going to the general election, you know that you're going to win. So it's not a 2-for situation, like, for instance, with Kara Eastman in the 2nd congressional district, where she had to win a very tough primary against the Democratic establishment, a lot of obviously hard work and resources needing to go on and win that primary. But then you also have to try to win a very tough general election where you need a lot of resources to go on and win those. So you basically have to win 2 tough elections to try to win these toss-up districts. It's just a very tough road forward to try to win those types of districts for an up-and-coming group where your resources are limited because you don't take large amounts of corporate money, or obviously any corporate money at all. It's all people-funded grassroots. I think it's better to go for these very liberal-leaning districts like Minnesota's 5th congressional district, where if you have success and win the primary, then you know you're going to win the general election, so it's not quite as difficult. But the 3rd on the list, I actually think that putting resources, or at least the limited resources you need to win these primaries on the Democratic side in very Republican-leaning districts, is worth it at the end of the day for the Justice Democrats. So an example of this, Michigan's 2nd congressional district, Rob Davidson, going on an uncontested primary there in the 2nd congressional district. Democrats never have all that much success here. This is actually my home district, and Davidson doing better than any Democrat I've ever seen, at least in my lifetime, and bringing that progressive message to this type of district. I've seen it being planted with those progressive seeds that just a lot of these voters haven't been accustomed to hearing about, and they like the idea of Medicare for all, tuition-free college, a living wage. I think that down the line, this can pay dividends back to the progressive cause by spreading that message in these very Republican districts, and maybe not even necessarily flipping these districts, but when we talk about progressives running for president on the national stage, if Bernie Sanders, for instance, is the 2020 nominee, winning a state like Michigan isn't a shoo-in by any means. We saw Donald Trump take the state, but if you're able to have that progressive message start to spread through these more Republican districts like Michigan's 2nd, that's going to increase the chances of progressive candidates winning these statewide elections, for instance, going into the future. So I think that's a really smart idea, going in and taking these Democratic primaries where not a lot of resources anyways are put in by the DCCC and the corporate Democrats, because they know they're not going to go on and win those general elections. And then what I think are a really tough situation, that's going to be these districts where it's highly competitive, maybe 5 to 10 people are running. We had that, for instance, I believe Kansas's 3rd congressional district maybe had about 5 or so people running, but Brent Welder against Sharice Davids, where it was the corporate-backed candidate Davids and the progressive-backed candidate Welder going head-to-head. It was extremely close. And again, I don't necessarily think it's completely worthless to put effort into these types of races, but it's just so hard because you have to win against the big money interest in a primary, and then in the general election, you also have to win against the big money interests from the Republican challenger. So it's 2 tough elections in a row that you'd have to win, where I think that those resources might be better spent on the more liberal-leaning districts like Minnesota's 5th, Michigan's 13th, and again, I've already listed those other districts where the Justice Democrats were able to have success. So again, guys, just to quickly recap where I think the Justice Democrats should invest going forward, it's trying to get like-minded incumbents to join the team, and then beyond that, targeting very liberal districts that aren't going to have competitive general elections after you'd win the primary. And then third on the list, continuing to go for those uncontested or lightly contested, very Republican-leaning districts that don't necessarily have a lot of resources put in on the Democrat side to plant those seeds of progressive ideas in Republican areas. And then I think last on the list should be these highly competitive toss-up type districts, because it's just so difficult to win those two competitive situations, both in the primary and then the general election. So that's going to wrap up this video, guys. Thanks for stopping on in. Consider subscribing for more, and I hope to see you guys back here for future videos.